Welcome to our study of Romans, and it's a fitting time for us to be studying this book because the book, Paul tells us, is about the apocalypse of God, the unveiling of God in Jesus, and we're living in something of an apocalyptic moment in the United States where the developments recently in terms of pandemic, the yet further revelations of police brutality, white supremacy, just a kind of system of violence have forced us to see with even greater clarity, if we hadn't already, some of the widespread injustices that are a disease in the fabric of life that we have inherited. And so the moment is right, I think, for us to study our moment, you might say, the time that we're living in, the challenges that we're facing by the light of God's own self-unveiling in the person of Jesus. And Paul tells us, of course, that this is an unveiling of God's justice, which is a transformative power that is loose in the world, one that we desperately need in our lives, in our society, in our churches, in our world today. So I'm looking forward to studying this letter with you at a time that I think will allow its teaching to resonate powerfully in our own lives. I'm Tommy Gibbons, the course professor. I'll say a little bit more about my sort of personal background in my intro video in the introductions forum. But starting my 11th year, I guess, teaching at Fuller, and that's a delight for me. It's gone by very fast. I can't believe that I've been here that long. I teach primarily in New Testament in courses like this one, but I also teach some in Christian ethics. I teach at our PhD level as well as at the master's level. Enjoy doing some teaching also for our Latino Center in Spanish. So I'm fortunate to be able to see different kind of parts of Fuller as a seminary, and invariably those experiences kind of bleed into one another. So when I'm thinking, for example, about God's justice in a time like ours, I'm especially affected by the tenor of that conversation with Latino students at Fuller in Spanish language classes of mine. This course is on a book whose scope is overwhelming, and I expect that you're going to feel somewhat overwhelmed as we get into it. The reception history of Romans is massive. It has had a dramatic impact on the geopolitical distribution of power in the history of the world that we know. It has affected all kinds of social conventions, customs, sensibilities. It has its own kind of psychological influence as well. Its language has suffused a lot of the imagination of especially the Western world, and not always in a good way. But we have to take seriously that we are part of the legacy of this letter, even as we set out to study it carefully in a graduate course like this one. And as we do study it, to be mindful of the scope that we are wrestling with. Sometimes the letter has been read in certain circles as if it touched only upon matters that are highly individual or spiritual, that kind of thing, as if it had nothing to say about political power, as if it had nothing to say about the nature of the human and the psychological dynamics that animate human existence, when in fact these are matters that the letter addresses. And so we don't want to overly narrow its scope, in an attempt to sort of get it under control or maybe interpret it in a way that's very comfortable to us, we want to try to be open to the reach of this letter. And as we do, to be mindful of how its reach has not been unequivocally positive. Its effect on people's lives, as I would say we are seeing in our current moment, as I'll try to unpack a little bit more in the course, but its effect on people's lives, especially people systemically oppressed in white dominant societies like the US, has not been a positive influence in a variety of ways. And we want to be critical, you might say, about the intuitions that have informed its interpretation, because they can, I'd say they have been channels of oppression. And so we want to scrutinize intuitive interpretations of this letter, take those interpretations back to the text with voices that can help sort of alert us to other possibilities, perhaps open our eyes to tendencies that we have inherited, and to take a fresh look at what the letter has to say to us today. I think before I go much further about some of the emphases of the course, I want to say a brief word about some of the logistical matters of the course as it's going to be delivered online, that I think will help you just kind of stay on the same page, as it were, with the rest of the class, with me. First of all, you're going to see that I find it useful to organize our study of the letter week by week in modules. And so I think the modules view that you can sort of select in the left-hand column on Canvas is the most useful way to track the development of the course, because with each week a new module will be opened for you to begin working on, and that module will occupy us for an entire week before we move on to the next one. So using the modules view will help you, I think, sort of track with the course. We will be having weekly discussions of various kinds. You'll find after a few weeks that I'll be offering video discussion groups, and that will be an opportunity, not a requirement for you, and will replace work that you would otherwise do in writing in forum discussions. So I hope that many of you will take advantage of that. You'll find on the course syllabus, at the very end of it, I have a tentative course schedule that guides you sort of week by week through what we're going to be doing. And I've included in there not only the required and recommended reading for each week, but I've made those hyperlinks so that you can use the syllabus just to connect directly to readings that are available to you digitally. And those are readings in addition to the 2 required commentaries that you'll be using to follow through the book of Romans. So that's a convenient way, I think, for you to be able to get to the readings quickly without having to sort of look around on e-reserves for them and that sort of thing. So please avail yourself in the syllabus. Other than that, logistically, I suppose it's worth saying that the bulk of this course is really about the rigorous week-to-week interpretive work that we're doing with the text. There are only 2 formal assignments. They are both on the same passage that you will choose, and they're meant to be cumulative or sequential, so that the second assignment that you'll do will be a development of what you have done in the first assignment. But that's only 2 formal assignments for the whole course, and that means that I hope you'll really invest in the week-to-week work, because that really is where the meat of learning, I think, takes place in this course. And then the formal assignments come later and give you an opportunity, obviously, to refine your learning, but to demonstrate what you have learned by that point in the course as far as how to read the letter to the Romans. I want to just spend the last few minutes of this intro video presenting 3 key emphases of this course that if you have them in mind, I think that you will sort of be able to grow more in what you're learning about how to read the letter. The first is the key category of rhetorical purpose. Rhetorical purpose. Every passage of Romans, every segment of the argument of the letter as a whole has definite rhetorical purposes. It has definite aims that the way that it argues is attempting to achieve. And we have often neglected asking what that purpose is at each stage of the argument in the way Romans has been interpreted, because it's kind of been flattened out into an encyclopedia of sort of generalized Christian theology or something like that. And consequently, the particular aim that Paul has in saying what he's saying, how he is addressing a particular challenge among his readers, is lost. And our interpretation of key terms that Paul uses, terms like faith, salvation, justification, what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah, all of our interpretation of those key terms of our faith suffer because they are not actually disciplined or shaped, constrained even by the particular purposes that Paul has in saying what he says about them. So we're going to be asking, you're going to see in my prompts week in and week out that I'm asking you to crystallize to what end is Paul saying what he's saying here? What is he driving at? And that is finally an exegetical or an interpretive textual sort of question. You have to sort of follow the thread of the argument to tease out to what end Paul is saying what he's saying. It's very easy to lose sight of that, and then I think the interpretations that result tend to be distorted. So, rhetorical purpose is going to be one of our emphases. Second, we're going to study the letter as a letter that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we're going to study it starting at the beginning of the term, the beginning of the letter, and going all the way through the end, because the argument of the letter has a sort of cumulative quality to it. It is developing so that what Paul says at later stages in the letter is building upon what Paul has said in earlier stages of the letter. And this is another thing that we often neglect in the interpretation of Romans, because the way that we read it is usually to parachute into favorite passages, powerful passages, proof text passages, whatever, and we sort of extract from there something that we think it is saying that is totally oblivious to where that passage is, where that sentence is in the flow of the argument. It would be similar to doing something like parachuting into a scene of a movie at minute, 73 in a way that had no cognizance of how that scene fit into the dramatic development of the story of the film all the way to that point. And you can imagine how characters would be misunderstood, what they say to each other would not be understood very well. There would be all kinds of tone deafness to what's happening in the scene that we parachuted into, because we're just not taking into account how it depends on where it sits in the film. Same with Paul's letter. So we're going to focus on how each passage of the letter fits into the development of the letter and use that to guide how we interpret it. Finally, number 3, third emphasis. And this, I suppose, I've already intimated by what I've said up until now. I regard Romans as an intrinsically theological text, and as such, an intrinsically political text. I know those are both kind of polemical claims, so I'm just going to be giving a sort of cursory defense of them now, and we'll dive into them more. I just want to alert you to this. Sometimes Romans is read as if it were a museum piece that was lost in the past, and interpreting it was primarily a matter of unearthing something that has been dead and needs to be revived by historical study. I think historical study is important. but I don't think that interpretation is primarily about reconstructing a historical past. Interpretation is primarily about hearing God speak to us through this letter, and that does mean taking rhetorical, as I've said, historical particulars seriously, but never losing sight of the fact that this is a text that has remained alive and grown in a variety of ways across its generations of reception. It is alive with God's Spirit. It breathes, as a result, sort of God's word to us. And so we want to interpret it as sort of bristling with that kind of power, as opposed to treating it as something that is dead until we figure out how to make it come alive. Now, because of the content of this letter and other witnesses of Scripture to God's revelation, I also want to say that that means it's an intrinsically political letter. And by political, I don't mean that it fits with this or that party or tells you, what you're supposed to vote for, or that even that voting is the primary expression of political agency. I don't want to imply any of that. I mean political in the sense that this letter deals with how human beings distribute and share power, to live in certain ways, to not live in other ways, how people are treated, how wealth is distributed, how life is shared. That is what this letter is concerned with. It is a fundamentally pastoral letter as well in that sense. But sometimes the language of the letter is interpreted, say justification by faith, or what Paul says about the work of God in our hearts by the Spirit in chapter 5, as if that were not a public matter, as if that were not something that affects the way people relate to one another, the way that they share and distribute power to live in certain ways and not live in others with each other. And I don't want to perpetuate that tendency to underplay, to deny the actual political power that this letter is concerned with and that it conveys. So that's the sense in which I regard Romans as intrinsically theological and as such political. And part of my job in discussions with you is to tease that out, to clarify that, and for us to be able to talk openly about it together, to work on it together. It's funny, I'm finishing my video and realizing that there's one last thing that I probably should have said. That's an emphasis of this class, and with this I'll close. Romans has been read predominantly by Christians with the thought that it is opposing, correcting, superseding something Jewish. I think that that interpretation is wrong. And again, I realize that might be controversial, so I'll be unpacking that. But this letter, Paul writes to people of Gentile background, he says explicitly. He is not arguing against Jewish readers. He is arguing against some who are calling themselves Jews. That doesn't mean that they're an integral part of the Jewish community that they come from. He's writing to people that he says explicitly several times are of Gentile background. And the challenges that they face with respect to how to understand God's law, with respect to how to understand the past of this Israelite people into which they have been adopted, that sort of thing. So interpretations that implicitly frame the force of Paul's teaching as correcting something that is generally wrong with Judaism, you're going to find that I oppose those again and again, because I think that those are just rhetorically not tracking with the argument of the letter or taking seriously what Paul himself says in the letter about his audience. We're going to need voices, scholarly voices, that help us wrestle with this. And so I have enlisted Jewish scholars to help us wrestle with Paul's letters. Some of them are Christian, some of them are not. For the same reason, I have enlisted a lot of scholars that are not white, that are not men, because the white male dominance of the interpretation of this letter, I think, is a huge problem. And so we want to prioritize voices that come from elsewhere in the social fabric that alert us perhaps to some of the distortions that have characterized interpretation dominated by white men, which have not incidentally often been anti-Jewish. So that's a bit of a preview of the emphases of the course. Looking forward to thinking through it together, especially for how it lives among us in the moment that God has called us to live and to respond to ourselves. Looking forward to studying Romans with you this summer.